The courthouse air felt thick enough to choke on, as Natalie Harper clutched her trembling hands in her lap, watching the judge shuffle through papers that would decide whether her 2 children would be ripped from her arms and handed over to the man who had spent 3 years making her life a living hell. Fort Worth, Texas, in the summer of 1883 was unforgiving enough without the added weight of a courtroom filled with people who thought they understood her situation when they knew nothing at all. Her husband Richard stood across the aisle with his lawyer, looking every bit the respectable businessman in his pressed suit, his face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity that made Natalie's stomach turn, because she knew exactly what lurked beneath that carefully constructed mask. The bruises on her ribs had faded to yellow, invisible beneath the high-necked dress she wore, but the memory of how they got there remained vivid as yesterday. Her daughter Emma, only 6 years old, sat outside with a neighbor woman, too young to understand why Mama looked so scared. Her son Thomas, 8 years old, had started wetting the bed again after Richard's last visit, when he had cornered Natalie in the kitchen and reminded her in a voice like poisoned honey that no judge in Texas would ever believe her word over his. Judge Morrison peered over his spectacles, his weathered face impassive as stone. He had been on the bench for 20 years, and Natalie could see in his eyes that he had already made up his mind. Women did not leave their husbands in 1883, not without consequences. She had tried to explain to her lawyer, a young man fresh from law school who meant well but lacked the fire needed for a case like this, about the nights Richard came home drunk and angry, about the way he twisted her arm behind her back until she thought it would snap, about the time he had grabbed Thomas by the throat for spilling milk at supper. But her lawyer had fumbled through his questions, and Richard's lawyer had painted her as an hysterical woman prone to wild accusations, a neglectful mother who had abandoned her marital home over imagined slights. The back door of the courtroom creaked open, and Natalie did not turn to look because she could not bear to see more of Richard's friends filing in to speak on his behalf. They had already paraded through, one after another, talking about what a fine, upstanding citizen he was, how he donated to the church, and never missed a Sunday service. None of them had seen the way his hand became a fist when the door closed and the curtains were drawn. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his verdict, and Natalie felt the floor dropping out from under her. She thought about grabbing her children and running, heading west where the territories were still wild enough that a woman might disappear. But she had no money, no horse, nowhere to go. Richard had made sure of that, controlling every penny that came into their household, making her account for every cent she spent on flour and sugar. Then a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom, deep and clear as a church bell. "Your Honor, I have testimony that pertains to this case." Every head in the courtroom swiveled toward the source of the interruption. Natalie turned and saw a man she had never expected to see again, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Vincent Erickson was a cowboy she had met exactly once, 3 months ago at the general store, and the memory of that encounter flooded back with startling clarity. She had been shopping for Emma's birthday, counting out precious coins for a small bag of peppermint sticks, when Richard appeared out of nowhere and grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. He accused her of taking money from the household funds without permission, his voice low and threatening despite the public setting. She had tried to pull away, stammering explanations, but his grip only tightened. Then this cowboy had stepped between them, his presence commanding despite his dusty trail clothes, and told Richard in a tone that brooked no argument that he needed to let go of the lady's arm. Richard had released her, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment at being challenged in public. but he covered it with a forced laugh and claimed they were just having a marital disagreement. The cowboy had not looked convinced, his blue eyes sharp and assessing, but Richard had steered Natalie out of the store before anything else could be said. She remembered glancing back once and seeing the cowboy watching them leave, his expression troubled. Now that same cowboy stood in Judge Morrison's courtroom and Richard's face had gone pale. "This is highly irregular," Judge Morrison said, but there was curiosity in his voice. "State your name and your business." "Vincent Erickson, Your Honor." "I work cattle drives between here and Kansas, but I have been in Fort Worth the past 3 months working at the stockyards." He moved forward with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard living and straight talking. "I witnessed an incident between Richard Harper and his wife that the court should hear about before making any decision regarding those children." Richard's lawyer shot to his feet, objecting loudly, but Judge Morrison raised a hand for silence. The old judge might have been traditional in his views, but he was also known for his stubborn insistence on hearing all available facts before making a ruling. "I will allow it. Mr. Erickson, approach and be sworn in." Natalie watched as Vincent walked down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. He was tall and lean, built like a man who spent his days in the saddle, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that touched his collar. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a strong jaw and features that were more rugged than handsome, marked by a small scar above his left eyebrow. He wore clean clothes, clearly his best, though they were simple working man's attire, a pressed shirt and dark trousers with a vest, his gun belt notably absent in deference to the courtroom. After being sworn in, Vincent settled into the witness chair and looked directly at the judge. "3 months ago, I was in Henderson's general store when I witnessed Richard Harper assault his wife." "That is a serious accusation," Judge Morrison said. "It is a serious truth," Vincent replied without hesitation. "He grabbed her wrist with enough force that I could see his knuckles go white. She was trying to pull away, clearly in pain, and he was threatening her over a few pennies spent on candy for their daughter's birthday. When I intervened and told him to release her, the look on that woman's face was pure fear, Your Honor. That was not the face of a woman who had simply been startled. That was the face of someone who knew exactly what would happen when there were no witnesses around." Richard half rose from his seat, his lawyer pulling him back down and whispering urgently in his ear. Natalie pressed a hand to her mouth, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I started paying attention after that," Vincent continued. "I did not set out to spy on anyone, but Fort Worth is not such a large city that you do not notice things. I saw Richard Harper drag his wife down an alley beside the millinery shop 2 weeks after that first incident. I followed and heard him telling her that if she ever embarrassed him in public again, he would make sure she regretted it. He had her pushed up against the wall with his hand on her throat. I made my presence known, and he released her immediately, then claimed they were having a private conversation." "Why did you not report this to the sheriff?" Judge Morrison asked. Vincent's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we both know that the sheriff's office does not typically involve itself in matters between a man and his wife. I did speak to Mrs. Harper briefly after that second incident. I asked if she needed help, if there was somewhere safe she could go. She told me she had been trying to leave for months, but that her husband controlled all the money and had threatened to take her children if she ever attempted it. She said no one would believe her because he was well respected in town." Natalie felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She had forgotten that conversation, or perhaps she had pushed it from her mind because the kindness in this stranger's eyes had been too painful to dwell on when she felt so trapped and helpless. "I witnessed a third incident 4 weeks ago," Vincent said, his voice hardening. I was making a delivery to the house next door to the Harper residence. It was evening, and I heard shouting. Through the window, I saw Richard Harper strike his wife across the face, then grab his son by the arm and shake him violently. The boy could not have been more than 8 years old. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard's lawyer was objecting strenuously, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a sharp look. "You saw this through a window." "Yes, Your Honor. The curtains were open and the lamp was lit. There was no mistaking what I saw. I went to the door and knocked, claiming I had the wrong address. When Mrs. Harper answered, there was a red mark blooming on her cheek, and her son was crying behind her. Richard Harper came to the door and sent me away, but not before I saw the boy's arm already showing bruises where his father had grabbed him. Natalie remembered that night with horrible clarity. Thomas had accidentally broken one of Richard's pipes, and the punishment had been swift and brutal. She had tried to shield her son, and Richard had backhanded her for interfering. When the knock came at the door, Richard had threatened them both into silence before answering, and she had been too terrified to cry out for help when she saw the cowboy standing there. Vincent turned in his chair to look directly at Richard. "I have spent my whole life around animals, Mr. Harper, and I know what a mean horse looks like. I know the signs of an animal that has been mistreated and beaten until its spirit breaks. I saw those same signs in your wife and your son. A man who would raise his hand to a woman or a child is not fit to have custody of anything, let alone 2 innocent lives." "This is outrageous," Richard sputtered, finally finding his voice. "This man is lying, trying to insert himself into matters that do not concern him. He probably wants my wife for himself. That is the only explanation for this elaborate fabrication." Vincent's expression did not change, but something cold flashed through his eyes. "I have no designs on Mrs. Harper beyond ensuring she and her children are safe from a man who uses his fists to solve his problems. As for why this concerns me, I was raised by a father who beat my mother until she could barely stand. I watched her suffer in silence, because society told her that was her duty as a wife. She died when I was 15, and everyone said it was pneumonia, but I knew the truth. Years of being knocked around, having her ribs cracked and her spirit crushed, that is what killed her. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to speak up for someone who could not speak for themselves, I would do it. So that is why I am here, Your Honor, because those children deserve better than to be raised by a man who rules his household through fear and violence." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Morrison studied Vincent for a long moment, then turned his attention to Richard. "Mr. Harper, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I advise you to think carefully before answering. Have you ever struck your wife?" "No, Your Honor, I have not," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Have you ever disciplined your children with physical force?" "Only appropriate correction, as any father might," Richard said. "A boy needs a firm hand or he will grow up wild." "There is a difference between discipline and abuse," Judge Morrison said quietly. "I have 3 sons of my own, Mr. Harper, and I never once had to shake them hard enough to leave bruises to teach them right from wrong." Richard's lawyer tried to mount a defense, calling Vincent's testimony hearsay and character assassination, but the damage had been done. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway. Natalie sat frozen in her seat, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Vincent walked past her on his way out, and their eyes met briefly. She wanted to say something to thank him, but her throat felt too tight to form words. Her lawyer returned after 15 minutes, looking cautiously optimistic for the first time since the trial began. "The judge wants to speak with Thomas privately," he told her. That is a good sign. He would not bother if he had already decided in Richard's favor. They brought her son into the judge's chambers, and Natalie waited outside, pacing the hallway and praying harder than she had ever prayed in her life. Thomas emerged 30 minutes later, his young face serious but relieved. He ran to his mother and wrapped his arms around her waist, holding tight. "I told him the truth, Mama," he whispered. "I told him about all of it." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Morrison looked like he had aged 10 years. He delivered his verdict in a voice heavy with disgust. "It is the finding of this court that Richard Harper is unfit to maintain custody of his minor children. Full custody is awarded to Natalie Harper, with no visitation rights granted to the father until such time as he can demonstrate genuine rehabilitation, if ever. Furthermore, I am ordering that Mr. Harper is to have no contact with his former wife or children, and I am referring this case to the sheriff's office for potential criminal charges related to assault and battery." Richard exploded in rage, lunging across the aisle toward Natalie, but 2 deputies were already moving to restrain him. Vincent was faster, stepping between Richard and Natalie with the kind of reflexes that came from years of dealing with unpredictable cattle and dangerous men. Richard struggled against the deputies, hurling threats and obscenities, his carefully maintained mask finally cracking completely to reveal the ugly truth beneath. They dragged him from the courtroom, and Natalie collapsed into her chair, sobbing with relief so intense it felt like physical pain. Her children were safe. Her children were hers. She would not have to hand them over to the man who had terrorized them all. She felt a hand on her shoulder, gentle and steady, and looked up to see Vincent standing beside her. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked. "I do not know how to thank you," she managed to say through her tears. "You saved us. You saved my children." "You saved yourself," Vincent said quietly. "You were brave enough to leave him and fight for your kids. I just told the truth about what I saw." The courthouse gradually emptied, people filing out into the harsh afternoon sunlight of a Texas summer. Natalie's lawyer handled the final paperwork, and then she was walking down the courthouse steps with Thomas holding one hand and Emma, who had been brought back by the neighbor woman, holding the other. Her children were chattering excitedly, too young to fully understand the proceedings, but old enough to sense that something important had shifted, that the weight pressing down on their small household had finally lifted. Vincent was standing at the bottom of the steps, his hat back on his head, clearly preparing to leave. Natalie felt a sudden urgency, a need to not let this man simply walk away after what he had done. "Mr. Erickson," she called out. He turned, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip unexpectedly. It was not pity or satisfaction at having done a good deed. It was something warmer, something that looked almost like longing. "Would you allow me to buy you supper?" she asked. "It is the least I can do after everything you did for us today." Vincent hesitated, and for a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face, softening the hard edges and revealing the good man beneath the weathered exterior. "I would be honored, madam, but only if you let me pay. A lady should not have to spend money on someone like me." "Someone like you," Natalie repeated. "You mean someone who stands up for what is right, someone who speaks truth in the face of injustice." "Mr. Erickson, you are worth 10 of the so-called gentlemen in this town." They went to a small restaurant near the stockyards, the kind of place that catered to working men rather than society folks. The food was simple but good, thick steaks and potatoes, fresh bread and butter. Emma and Thomas devoured their meals with the enthusiasm of children who had been living under constant stress, their appetite finally returning. Vincent entertained them with stories about cattle drives and life on the trail, carefully editing out the dangerous or inappropriate parts for young ears. Natalie watched him interact with her children and felt something unfurling in her chest, something she had thought Richard had killed years ago. It was not just gratitude, though she felt that in abundance. It was the beginning of genuine affection, the recognition of someone whose character and values aligned with her own. Vincent was patient with Thomas's endless questions, and he treated Emma with the kind of gentle respect that made the little girl giggle and hide behind her hands. After the meal, Vincent walked them back to the boarding house where Natalie had been staying since she left Richard 3 months ago. It was a modest place, but it was clean and safe, and the landlady, Mrs. Patterson, was a widow who understood what it meant to survive on your own in a world built for men. Vincent tipped his hat at the door, preparing to say goodbye, but Natalie found herself catching his sleeve. "Will I see you again?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for being so forward. But Vincent's expression softened, and he covered her hand briefly with his own. "I would like that very much, Mrs. Harper. If it would not be inappropriate, perhaps I could call on you sometime, when enough time has passed that it would not cause gossip or trouble for you." "I do not care about gossip," Natalie said firmly. "I have spent too many years caring what people think, staying silent to avoid scandal. Those days are over. But I do care about doing right by my children, and they need time to heal from everything they have been through. Could we perhaps start as friends? You could come to supper here at the boarding house with Mrs. Patterson present. Nothing improper, just a chance to know each other better." Vincent agreed, and true to his word, he began visiting twice a week. He always brought small gifts for the children, a bag of marbles for Thomas, a rag doll for Emma, nothing expensive but clearly chosen with care. Mrs. Patterson approved of him, which carried considerable weight. The older woman had a sharp eye for character, and she declared that Vincent Erickson was the sort of man who said what he meant and meant what he said. As summer faded into autumn, Natalie found herself looking forward to Vincent's visits with an intensity that surprised her. They would sit on the boarding house porch after supper while the children played in the yard, and they would talk for hours. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his hard father and his gentle mother, about the day he left home at 16 to make his own way in the world. She told him about her own past, about growing up in a strict household where girls were taught that their purpose was to marry well and obey their husbands without question. She had met Richard when she was barely 18, and he had seemed charming at first, attentive and generous. The abuse had started slowly, after the wedding, small criticisms that gradually escalated into control and violence. Vincent listened without judgment, and he never once suggested that she should have left sooner or done things differently. He understood, in a way that few people could, that leaving an abusive marriage took more than just physical courage. It required dismantling all the beliefs you had been taught about duty and obligation, rejecting the voice in your head that said you deserved the treatment you received. Winter arrived, bringing cold winds that swept across the Texas plains. Vincent's work at the stockyards was seasonal, and he mentioned that he would likely need to move on come spring, heading north with the first cattle drive of the year. The thought of him leaving created a hollow ache in Natalie's chest, and she realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with this quiet cowboy who had saved her family, and then stayed to help pick up the pieces. It was Thomas who brought things to a head one evening in early December. The children were getting ready for bed, and Thomas looked at his mother with the solemn wisdom of an 8-year-old who had seen too much. "Mama, are you going to marry Mr. Vincent?" Natalie nearly dropped the lamp she was holding. "What makes you ask that?" Because he looks at you the way Papa used to look at his whiskey bottle, Thomas said seriously. Like you are the most important thing in the world, but in a good way, not a scary way. And you smile now when he comes around. You did not smile for a long time, Mama. Out of the mouths of children, Natalie thought. She kissed her son's forehead and told him to get under the covers, but his words haunted her through the night. The next time Vincent came to call, she asked if they could take a walk, just the two of them. Mrs. Patterson agreed to watch the children, giving Natalie a knowing look that made her blush. They walked toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie land stretching endlessly under a sky full of stars. The night was cold but clear, and their breath formed clouds in the air between them. Finally, Natalie gathered her courage and spoke. "You mentioned that you will be leaving in the spring." "Yes," Vincent said carefully. "The stockyards slow down in winter, and come April the trail bosses will be hiring for the drive to Kansas. It is good money, and I have been saving up." "Saving up for what?" Natalie asked. Vincent stopped walking and turned to face her. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "For a piece of land, eventually. I have spent 15 years working other men's cattle, sleeping under the stars or in bunkhouses. I am not getting any younger, and I would like to have something of my own before I am too old to work it. A small ranch, maybe, nothing fancy. Just enough to raise some horses, build a house that is actually mine." "That sounds lonely," Natalie said softly. "It does," Vincent agreed. "It did not used to bother me, the idea of being alone. I figured loneliness was better than ending up in a bad marriage like my parents had. But then I met you, Natalie, and suddenly that empty house I have been imagining has you in it. You and those kids. I know it is too soon, and I have no right to even think such things, but I cannot help it. You are all I think about these days." Natalie's heart was racing, but it was not fear. It was exhilaration, the feeling of standing on the edge of something new and unknown and wonderful. "It has been 7 months since I left Richard," she said. 7 months since the trial. People would call it scandalous if I remarried so quickly, especially to someone like you." "Someone like me," Vincent repeated, and there was a note of resignation in his voice. "You are right. You deserve better than a cowboy with dirt under his fingernails and nothing to his name but a bedroll and a horse." "Stop," Natalie said fiercely. She grabbed his hands, holding them tight between her own. "I did not mean it that way. I meant that people would judge me for choosing someone honest and good instead of waiting for another respectable businessman who might turn out to be just like Richard. But I do not care what people think anymore, Vincent. You taught me that when you stood up in that courtroom and told the truth even though it was not your fight. You taught me that doing the right thing matters more than maintaining appearances." "What are you saying?" Vincent asked, and his voice was rough with hope. "I am saying that I love you," Natalie said, the words coming out in a rush. "I am saying that if you want a wife to fill that empty house you are planning to build, if you want children who will call you Papa and mean it with their whole hearts, if you want someone who will stand beside you through whatever comes, then you have found her. But I come as a package, Vincent. Me and Thomas and Emma. We are a family and we cannot be separated." Vincent pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt wetness on his cheeks that might have been tears. "I would not want to separate you," he said hoarsely. "I already love those kids like they were my own. I have from the first moment I saw that little boy's bruised arm. I wanted to protect all of you, and then I wanted to be part of your lives, and now I just want forever. If you will have me, Natalie Harper, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice." They were married in February of 1884, A small ceremony at the Presbyterian church with Mrs. Patterson and a few of Natalie's friends in attendance. Thomas and Emma stood up with them, their faces shining with genuine happiness. The children had taken to calling Vincent Papa Vincent within weeks of the engagement, and he had teared up the first time Emma climbed into his lap and called him that without prompting. Richard had disappeared after the trial, leaving Fort Worth in disgrace once word spread about the judge's ruling and the reasons behind it. Natalie heard rumors that he had gone to Dallas or perhaps further east, but she did not care. That chapter of her life was closed, and she refused to waste another moment thinking about the man who had stolen too many years already. Vincent kept working through the winter, saving every penny, and by spring he had enough for a down payment on a small ranch about 20 miles outside of Fort Worth. It was rough land, rocky and dry in places, but there was a creek running through it and enough grazing for a modest herd. The house was barely more than a cabin, 4 rooms total, but it was structurally sound, and Vincent promised to add on as they needed space. They moved in during April, when the Texas prairie was covered in wildflowers and the air smelled like grass and possibility. Thomas and Emma explored their new home with wild enthusiasm, running through the open spaces and discovering things that city children never saw. Horned lizards and jackrabbits and vast stretches of sky unmarred by buildings. Natalie stood on the porch of her new home, watching her children play without fear for the first time in their lives, and felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Vincent came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "I spent so many years just trying to survive each day, I forgot what it felt like to actually look forward to the future." He turned her in his arms and kissed her, slow and sweet, and she marveled at how different love could be when it was built on respect and trust instead of fear and obligation. Their wedding night had been tentative and gentle, both of them aware of the trauma she carried, but Vincent had been endlessly patient, letting her set the pace, making sure she knew she could say no at any time without consequences. That patience had allowed her to slowly rediscover her own body as something that belonged to her, not as a tool to be used by someone else. The first year on the ranch was hard work, the kind that left them exhausted at the end of each day, but it was good exhaustion, the satisfaction of building something real. Vincent taught Thomas how to ride and rope, how to mend fences and care for horses. Emma helped Natalie plant a garden and learn to can vegetables for the winter. They acquired chickens and a milk cow, and gradually the ranch began to feel like a true home rather than just a place they lived. Natalie discovered that she was pregnant in the autumn of 1884, and the news filled her with complicated emotions. Her previous pregnancies had been marked by fear, knowing that she was bringing children into a house filled with violence. But this pregnancy was different. Vincent was overjoyed, and his careful attentiveness made her feel cherished rather than confined. He insisted she rest more, taking over her heavier chores without complaint, and he would talk to her growing belly at night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and promising to be the kind of father who built up instead of tearing down. Their son was born in May of 1885, a healthy baby with Vincent's dark hair and Natalie's gray eyes. They named him James, and Thomas and Emma were fascinated by their new brother, arguing over who got to hold him and help with his care. Vincent was a natural father, patient with the sleepless nights and endless demands of an infant, and watching him rock baby James while singing old trail songs in his rough voice made Natalie fall even more deeply in love with her husband. The ranch prospered slowly but surely. Vincent had a gift for working with horses, and he began buying young colts, training them, and selling them to ranchers and cattlemen who appreciated a well-broke mount. Word spread about the quality of his work, and soon he had more business than he could handle. Thomas showed a real aptitude for the horse work, and father and son would spend hours in the corral together, working with the animals with quiet concentration. Emma, meanwhile, had inherited her mother's practical nature and her stepfather's way with creatures. She took over the care of the chickens and started raising rabbits, selling the offspring in town for pocket money. At 9 years old, she was already demonstrating the kind of independence and confidence that Natalie had never been allowed to develop as a child. Years passed in a rhythm of seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and rewards. There were hard times, droughts that withered the grass and made water scarce, winters when illness swept through their livestock. But there were more good times than bad. Holidays celebrated with laughter and plenty, birthdays marked with homemade cakes and small gifts, evenings spent on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Natalie gave birth to a daughter in 1887, a little girl they named Grace, and then another son in 1889, whom they called Samuel. The cabin that had seemed adequate for their small family was expanded multiple times, growing into a proper ranch house with bedrooms for all the children, and a spacious kitchen where Natalie could prepare meals for her growing brood, and the occasional ranch hand Vincent hired during busy seasons. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his stepfather, with Vincent's steady temperament and work ethic. He never spoke about his biological father, and as far as he was concerned, Vincent was his real papa in every way that mattered. Emma blossomed into a sharp-minded young woman with a head for figures, and she began keeping the ranch books when she was 14, tracking expenses and income with meticulous care. The younger children, James, Grace, and Samuel, grew up knowing only love and security. They had no memory of the dark times before the ranch, and their childhood was marked by the kind of freedom and joy that came from being raised by parents who genuinely liked each other and worked as partners. Vincent and Natalie's marriage deepened over the years, weathering the inevitable disagreements and challenges that came with building a life together. There were arguments, of course, because they were both strong-willed people with their own opinions, but they learned to fight fair, to listen to each other, to compromise without keeping score. Natalie never feared Vincent's anger because he never used his strength as a weapon, never raised his voice to intimidate or his hand to harm. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Vincent took Natalie into town for a rare dinner at the finest restaurant Fort Worth had to offer. The children stayed at the ranch with Thomas, who at 19 was more than capable of managing his younger siblings for an evening. Over candles and good food, Vincent reached across the table and took Natalie's hand. "I want you to know something," he said seriously. "That day I walked into the courthouse, I did not expect to fall in love. I just wanted to do the right thing, to speak up for someone who needed help. But you changed my entire life, Natalie. You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving, a reason to build something permanent. You gave me a family, and you taught me that I was capable of being the kind of man my father never was." "You were always that kind of man," Natalie said, her eyes bright with tears. "I did not make you good, Vincent. I just gave you a chance to show the goodness that was already there. You saved me and my children, and then you gave us something I never thought we would have. You gave us a home where we could heal and grow and become our best selves. I wake up every morning grateful that you were in that general store 10 years ago, grateful that you cared enough to pay attention, grateful that you were brave enough to testify. "I would do it again in a heartbeat," Vincent said. 1,000 times over if it meant ending up here with you. They returned to the ranch that night to find all 5 children still awake, waiting for them in the parlor. Thomas had organized a surprise party, complete with a cake that Emma had baked and decorations that the younger children had made from scraps of fabric and paper. The family celebrated together, laughing and eating cake, and Natalie looked around at the faces of her children, at the home they had built with love and hard work, and knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her place in the world. The years continued to roll by, marked by milestone after milestone. Thomas married a local girl in 1896, a sweet-natured young woman named Sarah who fit into the family seamlessly. They built a house on the far edge of the ranch property, and Thomas took over more of the day-to-day operations, allowing Vincent to slow down just slightly as he entered his 50s. Emma announced in 1898 that she had been accepted to a teaching college in Dallas, a rare opportunity for a woman of her era, made possible by her sharp mind and the money she had saved from years of managing the ranch accounts. The younger children followed their own paths. James decided to study veterinary medicine, fascinated by animal care and blessed with the patient hands needed for that kind of work. Grace shocked everyone by declaring her intention to be a journalist, inspired by stories she had read about lady reporters in the big eastern cities. Samuel, the youngest, was still finding his way, but at 11 years old he was already showing signs of inheriting his father's gift with horses. Through it all, Vincent and Natalie remained the steady center of their expanding family. They grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces acquiring the lines and creases that came from years spent outdoors and years spent laughing. Vincent's hands grew rougher and more scarred from decades of ranch work, but they remained gentle when they touched his wife, and Natalie's body bore the marks of bearing 5 children, but Vincent still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. In the early spring of 1902, nearly 20 years after that fateful day in the courthouse, they found themselves alone on the ranch for a rare afternoon. All the children were occupied elsewhere, Thomas running errands in town, Emma home visiting from her teaching position, the younger ones at a neighbor's ranch for a birthday party. Vincent suggested they ride out to the creek, to the spot where they used to take the children for picnics when they were small. They rode slowly, comfortable in the saddle after so many years, and spread a blanket on the creek bank under the shade of an old cottonwood tree. The water burbled past, and birds sang in the branches above, and for a while they simply sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from knowing each other so thoroughly that words were often unnecessary. "You ever think about that day?" Natalie finally asked. "The trial." "Sometimes," Vincent admitted. "I think about how close you came to losing everything, how close those children came to being trapped with a monster. It makes me sick even now." "I think about it too," Natalie said, "but not the way I used to. For years after, I would wake up with nightmares, terrified that the judge would change his mind or that Richard would come back and take the children. But those nightmares stopped a long time ago. Now, when I think about that day, I think about how it was the beginning of this life, our life. Everything good that I have, everything beautiful, it all started because you were brave enough to speak up." "You were the brave one," Vincent said firmly. "You were the one who left, who fought for your kids, who built a new life from nothing. I just told the truth." "You do not give yourself enough credit," Natalie said, but she was smiling. They had this argument periodically, each insisting that the other was the heroic one, and it always ended the same way. Vincent pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They stayed there until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. And then they rode back to the ranch together, side by side the way they had been for nearly 2 decades. Their children grew and thrived, building their own lives while remaining connected to the family ranch. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children, giving Vincent and Natalie grandchildren to spoil. Emma married one of her fellow teachers, a quiet man who loved her fierce intelligence and ambition. James opened a veterinary practice in Fort Worth, but came home regularly to help with the ranch animals. Grace became a journalist just as she had dreamed, writing for a newspaper in Houston, but returning home for every holiday. Samuel eventually took over the horse training business, expanding it beyond what his father had ever imagined. Vincent and Natalie aged into their 60s, and then their 70s. Their lives intertwined so completely that neither could imagine existence without the other. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had celebrated triumphs and mourned losses, had built something that would outlast them both. Their love story had not been conventional, and it had started in the worst of circumstances, but it had grown into something solid and enduring, a testament to the power of choosing kindness over cruelty, truth over convenience, and love over fear. On a warm evening in 1909, they sat together on the porch of the ranch house they had expanded and improved over 25 years of marriage. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across Texas, living their own lives, and the ranch ran smoothly under Samuel's capable management. Vincent's hair was white now, and his hands trembled slightly with age, but his eyes were still the same blue that Natalie had fallen in love with, still full of warmth and devotion. "We did all right, did we not?" Vincent said, looking out over the land they had built together. "Better than all right," Natalie replied, taking his weathered hand in her own. "We did something extraordinary. We took broken pieces and made something whole. We raised children who know how to love and be loved. We built a home that stands as proof that good can triumph over evil, that speaking the truth matters, that one person's courage can change everything." "One person," Vincent said with a smile. "Always giving me too much credit, Natalie Erickson." "Never enough credit," she countered, but she was smiling too. "You are the best man I have ever known, Vincent. Marrying you was the easiest decision I ever made, and I have never regretted it for a single moment. Even when I tracked mud through your clean kitchen," Vincent teased. "Even then," Natalie laughed. "Even when you insisted on bringing home every stray dog that wandered onto the property. Even when you taught the children to rope and they accidentally lassoed the milk cow. Every single moment with you has been worth it." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one overhead, the same stars that had watched over them through all the years of their marriage, through triumphs and struggles, through the raising of children and the building of dreams. The ranch would continue after they were gone, passed down through generations who would know the story of how it began, how a cowboy testified in a courthouse and saved a family, how love grew from the ashes of trauma and became something beautiful and lasting. Their story was not perfect, because real life never is. There had been hard times and sad times mixed in with the joy. But it was a true love story, the kind that proved love was not just about grand romantic gestures, but about showing up every day, about choosing your partner again and again, about building a life together brick by brick and year by year, until you had created something that neither of you could have built alone. Vincent and Natalie Erickson lived into their 80s, surrounded by the love of their children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they had done something rare and precious. They had transformed pain into healing, fear into security, and loneliness into belonging. They had proven that it is never too late to start over, never too late to find real love, never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. And it all started because one cowboy decided that the truth was worth telling, even when it was not his fight, even when it would have been easier to look away. Because of that choice, 5 children grew up safe and loved. Because of that choice, a woman who had nearly lost everything found not just survival but genuine happiness. Because of that choice, a lonely cowboy became a husband and father, filling the empty spaces of his life with laughter and purpose. In the end, that is what love does. It takes the broken pieces of our lives and makes something whole. It turns strangers into family, transforms fear into trust, and proves that even in the hardest circumstances, hope can take root and grow into something magnificent. Vincent and Natalie's love story began in a courtroom in Fort Worth, Texas, in 1883. But it lived on long after they were gone, in the memories of their descendants, and in the legacy of the life they built together on a small ranch under the vast Texas sky.